Hello everyone, today we talk briefly about the Hurri-Mitannian chariot. We have a series dedicated specifically to the wagon itself, right? And to the horses, of course, that pull it, and their armor. And the charioteer will be dealt with in another video, even though we can hint at some kind of aspect of the chariot armor that, of course, applies, generally speaking, to the entire crew as well, normally, because of course there were different shades of protection, like always, different kind of heavier, lighter chariots. Chariots were in fact properly deputed to different tactical roles, sometimes owned even by the same class, right? This is the aspect of this world that we have somehow removed from our understanding. We are looking mostly at a seigneurial system. And speaking of the Hurrians, the Mitannians, you know what we're talking about, essentially, that we are in the mid-second millennium BC, right? So a heck of a long time ago, but in a time in which chariot warfare has already spread as far as Mesopotamia, the Hurrians fundamentally started appearing as a distinct people in what today we can call the Jazeera, right? Between, like in Mesopotamia, between Syria and Iraq, and some areas also of Turkey, and in broader areas, because we can't really, in fact, draw such a definitive line. The Hurrians, from which eventually the Mitannian state, we can say, emerges in the following centuries, in the 16th, lasting until fundamentally the 14th, when the Hittites will crush it, right? And not before the Mitannians having, in fact, first warred with Egypt, then allied themselves with them, eventually in an anti-Hittite function. And we're talking about one of the most developed military culture of the time, right? We know much better historically, a bit like the Syrian, the Hittite, the Canaanite warchariotry, especially in this area that, as you know, would make it spread consistently also in other powers, such as Egypt and so on. The thing spread naturally very contemporary in many ways. The important, though, is assessing quantitatively how fast this war chariot culture consolidated in different countries that somehow had, in fact, a greater or lesser quality, militarily speaking. This depends, of course, on the main political and social issues, but let's say that in this mid-second millennium BC, especially the Mitannian military culture is really peaking and having a great influence, likely, on the surrounding ones, and triggering some further developments that eventually you can also track, document better through different series of sources, right? For the Hurrians, the Mitannians, we mostly rely on some inventories, lists, kind of tablets, naturally, which that were connected, of course, with their state, their subtle administration, dealing with the chariots storing, and that's why we know so much about that. From a year or so, I started. Actually, this dates back to the beginning of Schwerpunkt, but let's say from some time now, I have reinvigorated properly the Bronze Age series per se. So we have already talked about chariot warfare during the Bronze Age, and so what warfare was at the time concretely about. We look naturally as something that appears to be somehow standard, but naturally, as I was saying before, there are different steps, different gradual levels, let's say, of development that have to do, in fact, with the political capacity to, in fact, to commit the right amount of resources, ordering them, and, in fact, carrying out this major effort, it was mostly substantiated in warfare. This is what these cultures were about. These peoples came. We don't know exactly also much about the culture, the ethnicity of these peoples. There is to stress the Indo-European character of some of the, at least of the main military, say, identity indicators of peoples like the Mitannians. For example, the Marianne, that were essentially the knights, the youth, the noble is a term that applied to their, in fact, to their knights, right? So mostly the file and rank charioteers, as far as properly the warrior, of course, with his retinue was concerned. Some Mariana didn't have a chariot on their own, but it's as if you were talking, I don't know, about 10th century warfare. There were militas that were such, but for example, would dismount to fight, and or at some point might have not properly fought with a horse. So we're talking about incredibly primitive and archaic times. So even if you want to distinguish what was, for example, heavy from light, and also the relative effectiveness of the chariot per se, that naturally was used to full effectiveness in a collective tactic, right? You realize that, of course, at this point, heavy armor did exist compared to, of course, but the more average one. The latter, in fact, maybe distinguishing the heavies or the lights from very few, say, items, right? That to us technologically may not seem a big deal, but that at the time, for the surplus available to cooperate, was really a lot. So when we look at inventories such the ones from Nuzzi, in this Mitannian case, listing large numbers and various types of horse and chariot armor, we realize of the scale of the collective effort to make these armies work, right? And how costly, as we will see now, even just a set of horse armor really was, right? And consequently indicating how powerful also the owners were, as far as also the rest of the population was concerned. Mari, as we were saying before, is to be found in the Vedic texts, refers to very eloquently the same kind of chivalric, knightly, and feudal kind of mindset exists, again, of an heroic warfare like the Bronze Age one fundamentally was. So you realize that there were peoples, and of course the, say, chariot warfare emerged from the European steppe and spread around. And so when you look at Mesopotamian history, you realize there is always this kind of nomadic element that attacked the sedentary one, bringing, in fact, a more advanced military culture, or at least kind of more successful one, in as much as not just chariot warfare spread, as you know, far and wide, from China to the British Isles and so on, but also somehow Indo-Europeanized, we could say, Europeanized the local populations, and that's why we don't know from the Mitanni whether this knights, right, this youth, this nobility, was actually just a terminology used to call the knights per se, just as a foreign loan, let's put it this way, or if there were actual elements coming from the Indo-European steppes and beyond, right? You know that there's great debate because we simply can't document it clearly. The degree, in fact, of which how many Indo-European peoples, or say at least Indo-European creations, are at the base of some very important polities, such as the Assyrians, etc. So that's something we will discuss in another video. But I would say the question is yes and no at the same time. I mean, the Mitanni were likely not an Indo-European people just per se. We know it because their language is substantially different, right? So even these kind of Maria accusative and is something typical of the Mitannian language. So it doesn't seem to, it seems to have been mostly alone, but there is no doubt that it was full of adventurers roaming this broader Middle Eastern space, coming from, in fact, both the Indo-European steppes, but other areas that had been significantly influenced by that military culture. And it was probably also the interest of the local rulers to, as we've seen also in other videos, to accept newcomers, as far as especially the army was concerned, so that these would tend to depend on the sovereign in a sea of otherwise, in fact, local nobility was, or aristocracy was not particularly fond of centralizing attempts. There were people that also could fight pretty hard, right? Just, also as much as the locals could, because we don't have a kind of just of a broader measurable pattern of how effective or ineffective at a given point these systems were. We can just look at an average and lots of ups and downs politically, for which we understand that, at least as far as the chariot element was concerned, there was still a lot of influence, both in men and in kind of in ideas from from the steppe. For the rest, the Mitannian state, it was pretty wide, right? It stretched almost up to Nineveh, right? It was probably a mountainous area. It was a bit like the homeland of the original Hurrian state, and then the Mitannian one was formed mostly in Mesopotamia, right? But there was a continuous pouring. In fact, the dynamic, the mountaineers probably formed also in the flatlands that fueled such military quality of some sort. Infantry was important, by the way, in these in these military cultures, of course, in a subsidiary role to the chariot warfare. We don't have, especially for pitched battle, large-scale ones, properly the full picture of where they were located, etc. But tactics were obviously based on combined arms, right? The war chariot just per se was again owned and commanded by these knights and his retinue. So some of this retinue was also on foot, right? And the reason being that while especially in the flatlands in Mesopotamia, it was a districtuation, where cities were important centers for the time standards, fortified, entrenched, right? So that also needed infantry to be stormed, but in general, being properly districted in various towns that were enfeoffed by the king to these various adventurers, lords, knights, right, with a various degree, right, because the Mariana were, by the way, stratified. We know of different types of them, and naturally everything was based on a pretty kind of fluid ranking that could rise and fall depending even just on how much you own, or how powerful you were, whether you could be recognized as such or not. Naturally, many of these warriors were autonomous, right? Once they were located in the province, like they would manage and defend it, and it's not very different considering as we've seen often, even Seljuk Syrian and in our Crusade warfare playlist, that this kind of pattern where you find kind of a more feudal, chivalric-minded, also steppe influence culture that rules over lands of millenary sanitarization, right? And you have essentially one main center that is ruled by what is recognized locally as the ruler, that fundamentally has an elite army that in this case was composed properly. We will see it in a video about Mitannian, about the Mitannian army organization, properly a royal guard that participated routinely in the frontier wars that were always there, by the way. integrating and probably also spearheading the provincial forces, right? And consider in those cities most of the effective inventories were found, most of the chariots were stored in the hundreds, which also by the pattern that this occurred probably reflected some kind of organic function. That is to say, probably this amount reflected a certain unit size and so on. So we will reconstruct it again better in another video. But just for telling you how, in that sense, how powerful even that monarch could be, considering the tributes that he could levy from the periphery, plus all the surplus that could be invested to organize, to train, right? Here we will see a bit the horses, etc. But in another video we will also observe how they were trained, right? That they were fed with barley, that there was probably of course there was a specific selection for, since the first year of age the horse was trained just alone without chariot. Then at the third year he was trained with a chariot, and normally in battle, let's say that the ones were older than 9 were used regularly. They were properly trained, not just collectively, but also to move for certain amounts, for certain specific distances daily, to test whether they could resist that, because everything had to be optimized, especially in a synchronized fashion. So you had all these animals having to perform that orderly maneuvers that would ensure, by conferring compactness to the unit, the success of the army in battle. And it was very complex because, as you know, the chariot warfare entailed also sort of caracole, right? That was carried out mostly in line by the subunits that would circle and shoot their arrows at the enemy. And then, but all this had to happen while the wall formation, or the wall wing, as it's also witnessed in this tablets, had to move back and forth sometimes. Very important, of course, were tactically the army or royal banners that could show also to the king, that was mostly stationed in the center, as far as it seems, during these clashes, at which point the wings were, right? So tactics that are a bit universal, that I specifically specialize in that tactic as far as medieval warfare was concerned, in a completely different context, with heavy cavalry in the center and wings, infantry wings on the flanks, plus reserves from the side. It surely existed at this point as well, if they managed to ambush the enemy, right, on a specific terrain. But everything was about timing, right? So consequently, whenever we look also at the wagon, the horse, armor, and everything related to it, you have to think that it's actually simple, right? But first of all, it cost a dramatic lot, an awful lot for the time. Also, just for upkeeping, from the sources we're told that these warriors constantly needed to fix their chariots that had problems and so on. But in that sense, also how liminally calibrated this whole arm system was, right, in terms of the weight of the resistance of the armor, the horse, training, resilience, naturally also the crew's skill, etc. So a level of individual and collective training of dramatic proportions, right? Even just individually remaining on those chariots that were fairly small at this time, and that were also somehow flexible, that may actually even go on rough terrain, not just on the flat plains. I mean, that would, of course, be preferred, especially for the larger engagements, but these wagons were used a bit everywhere where it was possible. A lot of dismounting was involved, a lot of remounting during the same combat. So this required, especially from the charioteer, It was mostly, in fact, the warrior himself very often. A level of athleticism that is astonishing to say the least, right? So entire lives spent on chariot. The horses were ridden, by the way, as well, alone, singly. Mostly at this point, as you know, cavalry didn't quite exist for fully integrated military roles, so we're talking mostly about scouting, exploring, reconnaissance, things like that. But we understand also from the aforementioned horse training that, of course, the horse was primarily trained by being ridden, right? So horsemanship was also probably much more developed than we think, as opposed just to charioteering. But it was necessary, and all these warriors knew how to right. And in order to do so, naturally they had to be incredibly rich for those time standards, because they had to be literally maintained for a lifetime doing this job, right? So, as I was saying before, many of these men were just essentially mercenaries, roamed the world, had extremely brutal lifestyles and ways and mindsets. They literally were running after the idea of being fundamentally demigods at this point. And like, if you were an average Mesopotamian peasant who saw them coming, etc., you would actually think the same. Because also the display of these chariots was actually impressive, right? Consider this is I mean, maybe it's anecdotal just to stress, but think about it. Here, today, we're habituated to planes, tanks, helicopters, even just as far as those that are properly manned vehicles, and then there are much more powerful armed systems and so on. But at the time, like, a war chariot is literally not just the strongest thing that exists, but in this sense, the one that nobody else can oppose. Right? Reflect this before the infantries of the sea peoples would toughen up enough to essentially bring to an end chariot warfare, at least to shrink dramatically until the end of the first millennium BC. That nobody has the political and social cohesion capable of opposing these chariots, if not with other chariots. Naturally, when I talk about chariots, I talk about the armies entirely, just per se. So, as I was saying before, even infantry did have an important role. There were cities, etc. So, Bronze Age warfare was not just about chariots, but mostly, and decisively, right, it was about that, especially in this quite for the time, brutally advanced and widely fertile in agricultural areas, also deeply populated ones that could sustain also such leaders and their increasing capacity of waging war, even at very long distances, which is fascinating. So the chariot in Hurri-Mitannian time was known as Narkapta, while the horses season. And what you realize from the inventories at our disposal is that they were often well armored, right? There was a specific emphasis at this point properly placed on the degree of armoredness of the chariots. And part of the reason being, of course, that kind of, at least, necessity of having a spearhead that would carry out a sort of caracal for which, independently from what the depth of the formations were, they had to rotate and go out there, right? We have seen, of course, in many tactics videos that the best way to defend against a missile opponent during the skirmishing phase is actually to saturate, to carry out a suppression fire that is enough per se, just even to shield you by suppressing the enemy, and thus not having much of a let's say a further armor on you. That's the reason why, while missile power increases dramatically in some contexts, right? You can look at the steppes or when Renaissance warfare, where firearms became truly more convenient than further armor, the latter practically disappearing at some point. That the best way is the collective effort. Naturally, with chariots, you can do this in a formidable way. The rate of fire of these battle lines was dramatic. However, it was the chariot per se was still, and the horse mainly was vulnerable to missile fire, and that's why they would have this emphasis on the horse protection, right? Which can find comparisons historically, but not quite, let's say, to the same degree, especially considering the chariot in its possibilities, its capabilities as a factor. We're not going to digress on that. The horses were as well armored as the charioteers per se, right? So it was crucial to keep them going. Also because if you basically fight with see here the chariot does use, as we've seen, infantry as a support, but fundamentally this is the decisive arm. This is what fundamentally constitutes the entire front line of battle. We don't have much even. Yes, there were surely some infantry units were interspersed in all this, but one thing is, as I was saying before, like maybe in the Middle Ages, when you have properly heavy cavalry in the center and just the infantry wings in a subsidiary role, you can look at the infantry and say, okay, well, this must be advanced by a certain degree. If you are just kind of running after the chariots and or shielding them in some other way, but these are effectively the decisive element of the army. Well, it's obvious that they are they're first of all taking on all the burden, most of the burden of the fight, at least in fact the decisive one. But in this sense, they have to cope with all what is happening in the front line. And given that the first phase was mostly about skirmishing, right, before the final charge over a enough softened up enemy, the necessity of a horse to be capable of enduring all this stress under fire, etc., brought to protect the equine as much as it was possible. Right? This is one of the reasons why this could happen. Naturally, we could have seen some chariots with an armored crew and horse. Yes, there was such a thing. Of course, there were also, normally it was 2 horses, right? And then for a chariot, then of course some could be even just have 1. It depends also on the type of chariot. So many haven't been found. Mostly, as always, we look at the elite finds, right? So that could, first of all, be preserved better on less perishable material and so on. Sometimes we get this info also indirectly. Sometimes, in fact, if you look at the representations from the chariot body of Thutmose IV that did fight around those places at the time quite closely with the Mitannians and so on, you see depictions that probably could easily fit without too many distinctions what the average, at least, enemy was out there at the time. They were unarmored, in fact, charioteers, lighter chariots of some kind, but the tendency does really seem to still maintain the chariot at a level of heaviness that could be well spent, especially in the battles, in the pitched battles. Like, that there is this tendency also in other times, especially when infantry is so like properly to increase the impact, the shock capacity of cavalry per se, and mostly that's what overall all these peoples were trying to pursue, right? Being ever more performing, more effective, more balanced. Again, it doesn't have even to be too heavy to be working, but the stronger the chariot, the greater chances you have to also banally even maintain the equilibrium during combat, because these people eventually would kind of smash into each other. Like, it wasn't just a distance thing, it was also a pretty brutally hand-to-hand kind of desperate situation. There, God knows what can happen to your chariot on a regular basis. There was always a risk factor. In fact, it does seem, looking at their tactics, that the wings were to be sent in and to play this game of hit-and-run tactics also when the bulk of the enemy army, likely in the center, was, let's say, disordered enough. Because, yes, they were all trained to perform these maneuvers, but on the battlefield, at a certain point, the order would begin to loosen. The situation would become less manageable, and so at that point, when there is enough disorder, these chariots, again, that do not increase. Like, it's easier, at least, to reform with cavalry, right? As later on will be proven. The chariot, again, has lots of problems. Again, they should have all more or less their own timing, and if a part of it is broken, etc., you just need space to falling back in some ways. So it's complicated. You can form jams, things like that, and so you can imagine the total mess would happen. That's also where infantry could simply rush, on the battlefield, finishing the fallen charioteers or something like that. So the picture is also probably more disorderly on a regular basis than it really seems. There was surely a lot of virtuosism, of individualism, still ingrained deeply in some of these men. So the big deal there was also to discipline these people. And the largest powers, like the Mitannian one at this point, would maintain some high standards of that in relative terms to the other peoples. From the inventories of the Nuzzi list, we see large numbers and various types of horse and chariot armor, highlighting the fact that especially the spearhead was properly comforted by some lighter elements that had to prepare the ground for its intervention, right? And or that were, however, to enter in battle different times and or in a sequence that it's somehow impossible to reconstruct with certain specific characteristics. And probably there was a lot of playing around this, especially in the larger engagements. We see the same in the aforementioned representations from the chariot body of Thutmose IV. Considered the Egyptians had fundamentally defeated the Mitannians under Thutmose III, and by Thutmose IV instead they became allies. There was a hard negotiation, but the Egyptians and the Mitannians eventually made some marriage alliances, mostly to stem the Hittite power from the northwest. It was pressuring them at that point, and being divided was, after those wars, right, probably is what brought the Hittites again back on track, and they would manage to subjugate the Mitannians only after a long and protracted amount of warfare that also probably shaped most of what we also appreciate as the peak of Hittite power, military-wise at that point. So what about the armor, right? Textile protection of felt or hair, about 3 centimeters thick, and extending from the withers of the horse to the loin, was the most common one. It was known as Parsha Shamu, and it was provided with a neck piece known as milu. This was important properly to, I imagine, just fixing the armor on the horse, because they would receive lots of blows, cuts, whatever. So, as you know, like a light armor as it may seem, for considering the broader development at the time, this was kind of a bit the basis, the sort of padded coat, right? But it was effective enough for the basic armor, right? The same men could be equipped with such textile armor probably was slightly different in composition than the horse one. I mean, not just the shape, obviously, but I mean, for different sensitivity of the man and the movements they have to carry out in battle. As I was saying before, like the average warrior at this point, say even the militiaman that was mobilized, there were militia chariots, by the way, because the local townsmen were ruled by some kind of aristocrat, right? They could field that. But say the average Mitannian warrior at this point on foot would mostly have just some kind of organic armor, right? Felt, hair, but also leather, right? That's it, right? You don't get much more. We'll talk about the metal one later. You'd say, but hair, like, yeah, because apparently it took 22 minas of hair to make 2 sets of horse armor. So how much was needed for horsing a single chariot, right? Which is a lot, and never underestimate this fact. It's like in Hellenistic times that in order to have torsion engine catapults, you need literally specific Asian woman hair. That it's not something you can immediately find, right? And also in enormous quantities, right? It's all something you have to be able to put together. You may have the wealth, generally speaking, but not the specific material, right? And that's also what makes the price on the market, by the way. And if you think that the whole Mesopotamia was engulfed in wars where the war chariot was as we've seen the core of it all, and the horses were expected to be armored at least with this kind of light protection, you can imagine how costly, how demanded the latter was, right? So this cost is maybe anecdotal, but probably not distant from reality, or of course this depended on, even in times of peace and war. But again, these guys were almost always out there, right? Fighting, where another. It was simply like it was not enough political stability to claim, okay, this season we don't go out, right? There is always an intervention. You have always your own. Say if you're a Mitannian king, you have your own children have to be sent fighting to prove that they are worth in front of the state, the city, the subjects, fighting for this, for that, having their own clientele circle, entourage, alliances, and so on. So it's all very bloody, by the way, and there's a lot of feuding. We can make videos about that, but you understand that surely these people would never get bored. Now, the Parash Shamu textile protection could be used on its own or as an undergarment for a leather, copper, or bronze scale sarium, or what was known as the horse armor as piece. By the way, the latter I have actually seen being used as a term for helmet, scale helmet at some point too, so I don't know how the term evolved over time, but I guess that it fits still the Mitannian chronology, and this probably means that either there were two very similar terms, or at least the distinction was not necessarily the one between horse and men and horse respectively. In any case, it's important to stress that the heaviest chariots and horses were in fact armored with leather, copper, or bronze scale armor. So something could be even quite elaborate and heavy, and as you understand, even more costly in general. So this would be especially in metal for just the ultra elite, right? There were surely other types of material use, right? Organic one, even bone or even stone at some point. there was a lot of imagination here, a lot of material that would probably surprise us also in the heterogeneity, right? By the way, as we'll see now, everything was painted and colorful. There were very specific meanings attached to and symbology attached to the various colors and so on. The same chariot body could be equipped with a scale cerium. And this is yet another important aspect of the wall, because of course the material of the chariot in wood, wicker, and so on could be very fragile itself. Particular attention towards the wheels, of course, was given. It was a much more resistant structure of the chariot and so on. But given that impacts could be pretty brutal, and not just crashes between chariots, but also blows, right, at full speed, it was important to armor even some of the wagon. The aspect, of course, is always the more you increase weight, and the slower this chariot is going to go, right? So, as far as the smashing capacity of a cavalry or chariot charge is concerned, naturally you can't go very slowly and still having a devastating impact, right? For whoever goes on motorcycle, it is known that even 20-30 kilometers per hour is already a pretty scary speed in terms of what can happen to you if you crash, right? So, or even lesser ones. So, considering that charges were carried out mostly at 45 kilometers per hour, something around that, they were launched at full speed. They had all a momentum, so the chariot was put in motion. This is more even than just cavalry, right? It's something heavier, right? So the sheer force put in motion there, and for somebody arriving from the opposite direction at the same speed, it's as if you were charging straight into the same object at 90 kilometers per hour, which is a pretty crazy speed as far as the human body resistance is concerned. We're just made to resist several kilometers per hour impact mostly in our bone structure. So just imagine even what could arrive at which speed, and we're not talking about arrows, by the way. So the more armored you were, the better it was. If you armored the chariot, by the way, you could perhaps make without some of the leg armor, right, or even the waist armor by some degree, probably not, but on average, but it's still kind of less weight, considering that you can maybe host even more than one person. Sometimes the thing is somehow convenient, right? It's just only for the ultra heavies, the elite, right? These things did make an important difference, right? Counting on the fact that, again, the caracole and how the horse is tired and so on is still part of a missile tactics. If you are practically using an armor that neutralizes the arrow per se, because that's basically what armor is brought to the limit of, just stopping that effect, right? Not necessarily even not being damaged or whatever, but absorbing as much as it's taken. It's mostly what the technology, both offensive and defensive, converge toward. You of course are going to wear out the enemy as far as the wounds, the damage is concerned, with much more difficulty, and it kind of puzzles your kind of your timing, your rhythm, even the amount of arrows that you carry with you. Naturally, from the other side, you have, however, a less mobile element that tires down earlier, and that is to be considered from the other side as well. So you always see a balance, right? One inventory of Mitannian chariots mentions over 100 of them with scale protection. So these were large quantities, right? Not just at some point this would have been, of course, part of maybe of a royal or still a very high level retinue, but having just under you a unit of 100 armored chariots, right? So that likely are also using armored horses, of probably of homogeneous protection, is huge, right? This was the ultra elite that on the battlefield would have smashed into anything, just with the sheer momentum that all that mass was could get, launched at that speed. That's also why we're talking about a center where probably this type of units were deployed, right? Because it's just the thing that you're going to frontally engage without too many diversions. It's the simplest tactic, is the one that also gets down just to the also most of the melee, and the truly punching one that you don't want to divert in force as a vector, right? Whereas the wings are, of course, composed of by something lighter. Not necessarily, again, of course, the probably was, even in spite of what we said before about the caracol turn, of course, some sort of segmentation, right? For the, considering especially this line, while caracoling was to return more or less the same order, because there is always a file opener, right? And this guy is likely the heaviest that leads, right? So even if they circle, and so at some point part of these troops are lighter and are more vulnerable to fire, still there is an order they have to recompose as a unit in row. The wing would be more mobile, right? It would be kind of more, presumably also more archery involved by some degree, right? Also because what is fascinating of this armor is that it appears to have covered also the horse's flanks regularly, right? So differently from, for example, medieval armor that you see basically until the 13th to 14th century, you don't even find full horse armor. Probably there was some padded stuff around that we can't find archaeologically, but also not much iconographically, that covered a bit like the entire horse, likely like a comparison or something. But metal armor was just confined mostly to the chamfron on the horse's forehead and on the chest, right? And that's where it starts appearing, but it remains the most. We do actually have evidence of kind of at least extra layers of chest armor for Mitannian times. Could be rendered different ways. Probably was a big deal of chamfrons, even though I don't think they're so. There are a few iconographic sources at least, and also a few archaeological ones, as you understand. But that would have been normal. And still, the idea is that the horse had to be not, as we've seen, just as well protected as the charioteer, but also from the flank, from any direction, which tells you in this kind of constant pirouetting of the chariot rows and so on the battlefield, and in domestic could unfold that, in fact, projectiles could come literally from everywhere, right? So when you find something like that, you know that there is a lot of outflanking maneuvers, a lot of pretty messed up situations in which you just want to be protected from any side, right? And of course we can debate and also speculatively on the degree of disorder that could occur on some of these battlefields once the engagement began. However, in the sense, don't stress it too much, because the idea of a sort of confused melee where even if this chariot had been more kind of less agile, more difficult to maneuver just than an average horseman would have become, and so on, still did maintain an important order, still did maintain like a some space. They were all trained for that, maintaining formation. If you lost that, you were kind of done for, unless the enemy hadn't lost it equally, right? So the idea is that, especially in that kind of caracole that we've seen for chariot archery tactics, exposing the flank was somehow normal, and you wanted to avoid the horse being hit in that crucial moment, also because that's the moment in which really he's exposing himself the most, because he's coming in front of the line and is turning, it's wheeling about, and he exposes his loins, right? So that easy to target, because probably also these engagements didn't, I mean, the bows had a somehow short range, so there could be a lot of kind of marksmanship involved exactly to hit the horse in that specific moment. It was with a bigger target, the belly exposed. And so, right, remember this, that the horse is just an extremely resilient animal. It can even cover 150 kilometers in a day. But it's extremely delicate as far as any kind of crippling, and it's also, intestinal is very delicate. It must be always preserved with an incredible care, and it costs a freaking lot because it consumes a horrendous amount of water and fodder, and given that the chariot complicates his agility and makes him just more exposed under, again, a hail of arrows that is the standard weather on the battlefield, let's say at any given time at this point, well, you want to probably protect the animal much more than what cavalry would do later, because cavalry was more compact, could concentrate, again, even with horse archery, kind of more volume of fire at a given time, and sheltering through that as opposed to armor the same horse. And it also can get out of the way much more quickly, right, than what a chariot can do. So consider there is also an important amount of space involved on these battlefields. There is also linearity, right? If the enemy rows would kind of confront each other while caracoling like that, and this would allow even some kind of concentrated fire even in front of above the chariot was in front of you, just to know more or less you were going to hit into that line. So everything was calibrated in ways that we cannot reconstruct satisfactorily, but we know that we're surely there in this kind of mindset. If we look at the chariot shown from the chariot body of Thutmose IV, you realize that there is scale probably covering on the cap, right, with a hole for the quiver as well, which is thus sheltered of course in the inner part of the chariot, like also to handle it more safely, but just at hand in a way that was fully functional, again, to that kind of immediate serviceability. Let's put it in this way. In some cases in this art, the scales on the coat of the horse can seem stylized. Maybe there was just in the organic armor some kind of mimicking aesthetically in design, etc., to real armor. Could be a way also to kind of maybe to hide it. There is a possibility, frankly, that some garment was used even over the metal one, which wouldn't be strange, by the way, because it could still make you appear let's say weaker than you were, so you could trick if you had a very aggressive mindset, but also you could prevent for example the armor from overheating, so that the metal wouldn't absorb just the solar radiations and just maintain heat that was especially as you understand in the Middle East during the good season, pretty damn cooking, to say the least. So also what you wanted to show was important in the first place. These colors were probably something to do with your lineage, with your gods, with your clan, with your master, and something of this kind. So it was important to show off those colors that just per se had a very precise religious meaning, and but were meant to somehow call also the divine glory on you during the fight. Remember that the horse was considered here in very unsecular fashion, right? He was thought to be a sort of divine medium of some way, just as much as, of course, humans were, but let's say we're living in a world that had not yet known, say, anything about, I don't know, the Hellenic categorization philosophically in a rational sense. So every single horse was only that horse, right? There is not a category, if not just by approximation, right? Everything had its own spirit, its own man, its own force, and it had to be cultivated, especially as a living being, and that's also how the training was properly conceived, both from for the man and for the horse. There had to be a great synchrony, by the way, between the charioteer and the horses. Obviously enough, the horses had to, of course, to agree with one another, and of course, if you get one kill, I have an experience in my past. I mean, in my ancestry, that where one of my he was my great grandfather was attacked at a point while he was driving a carriage with two horses, and allegedly, this is stories of my grandfather. He was being chased by some brigands, and there was a thunder who killed one of the horses, and he had to unlace him and just go with only one, but just for saying how, even what can happen in a battle, it can get down to in terms of, this magic couple, right? Like in the Platonic Legion with the black horse, the white horse, combining some forces to have the greater and most complete power at your disposal. Archaeological evidence exists for this type of metal armor, especially rectangular scales weighing 80 grams each, and being probably the heaviest one available. Not sure whether some kind of plate existed, but these are small plates, so technically that's where it gets down to. If you have a wall, horse armor, that technically is structured by, I think the neck piece, probably the milu, is something that the horse has, starting from, say, from his chest, arriving to his garter, right? And then the one on his back and his loins is another piece structured, and then there was probably again chamfrons and or some kind of neck and nape guards, right? And probably they were also joined by some kind of other organic armor in between. It's all possible because they were all composed, right? With different materials, also to afford a specific mobility, right? So you wanted to offer, of course, the maximum protection, but with the least weight and the greatest mobility of this case, the horse's neck, by the way. Because consider that horses aggress in combat, famously enough, so they're not just, say, drivers or pullers in that sense. The chariots could also be provided with simple dyed cloth covers known as puratu, right, which might have been maybe normal in a non kind of combat situation, parades. Well, parades, actually even heavier stuff could be posted, but let's say if you went around just with a horse normally, you didn't need all the full armor, right? Yes, they weren't particularly peaceful times anyway. You could be killed by practically anyone by some degree, but let's not exaggerate. I mean, of course, that would have been the more normal gear. We know of 12 goat skins with thongs being required to cover one specific chariot, one of our sources. So that's another type of organic material you could find, right? And this gives you also, the number of goats there being skinned to cover the chariot, which is interesting because I don't think 12 goats were so few, for example, for the average Mitannian farmer, and the equivalent was used just for the Maria, as we've seen, to the knights to cover their chariot, just to leave it there. And so this gives you the scales of the superiority of those individuals politically, socially. Chariots were drawn by a span known as simitta, of two horses, which not always were of the same color. I mean, they could be or they couldn't, but we do have evidence of that. So as I was saying before, probably there was some taste in combining the right blend that was meant to equilibrate one another. Say black and white, right, in the typical kind of tectonic and Uranian dichotomy, right? We are documented on the existence of red, black, white, and chestnut horses for the Mitannian period. And naturally there were others of different breeds. They've never made history of actually, maybe something about, of course, the Fergana ones that are more famous later on. But we should make actually something about the war horse breeds historically, because their history sometimes is amazing, and it was a dramatic melange, right, in stratification and experimental deal, and of course every horse was and is unique, and I can imagine there was an enormous, of course, economic interest around this and finding the best war horse in this world dominated by, in fact, warlords just setting forth with their, hordes of hundreds of chariots, and lots of legions and kind of culture made just by that. That's kind of also complicated to reconstruct, but because it's at the limit of zooarchaeology and other disciplines that, of course, I'm not particularly versed in. However, there is time, hopefully, to learn a lot more. We will keep talking about Hurrian and Mitannian warfare just because per se it deserves to. They literally will look just at the chariot and the horse as well, right? So we are really that limited, but there is so much, after all, we know properly about their military system through hierarchy, organic, and lots of other, in fact, political, social indicators that can help matching the picture we have drawn here, especially as far as the gradation of properly of horse protection, horse and also chariot protection that we have illustrated. I created, by the way, a playlist that specifically deals with chariot warfare, right? Probably I will create one about just the chariots, not just the warfare per se. However, you can find this stuff also in the Bronze Age warfare playlist and so on. So the Ancient Warfare one, etc. For today, however, stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.